الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله صلى الله وسلم على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اهتدى بهديه إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So continuing with our discussion on the history and development of Islamic law, the history and development of fiqh. In the previous lesson we looked at the preservation of the Quran. First, the need for revelation, the importance of revelation. We looked at the fact that the prophets are upon one religion. The religion of all the prophets is one. And we looked at that belief in the prophets and belief in the previous books is from the pillars of Iman, pillars of faith. And so a Muslim's belief is not complete until they believe in Jesus, and until they believe in Moses, and until they believe in Abraham and the other prophets that came before the Prophet ﷺ. And just as Allah Ta'ala promised and took it upon Himself to preserve the Quran, but it occurred through the doings of people. So just because in the Quran Allah took it upon Himself to preserve the Quran, it doesn't mean that we had no role to play and that God just decided to preserve the Quran. No one could touch it, no one can mess around with it, no one can change it. No. That promise was there, but it was done through the doings of people, such as the memorization of the Quran, such as the writing of the Quran. We looked at how the companions got together to compile the Quran, write it together. Abu Bakr did it along with Umar and Zayd ibn Thabit, and then in the time of Uthman ibn Affan, he also did a similar job and wrote down the Quran into several different copies and had a committee of companions working on that, and then it was sent around to the different Muslim lands. So all of this is the doings of people. The scholars of Islam have worked hard to perfect the exact pronunciation of the Quran in the science of tajweed, even in the science of qira'at, recitations of Quran. So you'll not find a similar amount of effort put into looking after the Quran than you'll find amongst the Muslim scholars. May Allah have mercy on them. Just as the Quran is preserved by Allah, the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is preserved by Allah. Again, through the doings of people. Some people might hesitate in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ being preserved. It's preserved. It's preserved. Because it's part of preserving the Quran. Because it's the meanings of the Quran. It's the meanings of the Quran. So if we only have the words of the Quran without its proper meanings, then that's a deficient preservation. That's a deficient preservation. Because we don't just need the recitation of the Quran, we need the knowledge of the Quran, the meanings, how it's to be understood correctly. And we can see today that, and this happens everywhere, people take advantage of any book or any text or any law for their own purposes and benefits. And that's why you'll find judges disagreeing despite the law of the land being the same. Judges will disagree on what a ruling should be. And so the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ was preserved through people also. How was it preserved? How were the words of the Prophet ﷺ preserved? We know the Quran. We said the Prophet used to teach the Quran. He used to recite the Quran in prayers. He used to have scribes, companions writing the Quran when he was having it revealed to him. And the companions agreed to collecting the Quran into one copy and then rewriting several copies of that same copy and then sending it around. With conditions, by the way. It wasn't just anyone who claimed, oh yeah, I heard a Quran from the Prophet ﷺ, write it down. No, that wasn't sufficient. The companions had already memorized the Quran, many of them. And on top of that, they wanted written proof. They wanted proof of Quran written in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. Not just written Quran. Proof that this was written in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. So there were strict conditions to make sure that this is accepted as being a Quran. And of course, It wasn't something the companions were going to disagree on because they were reading the Quran in their prayers every day anyway. And so they were constantly hearing it in their prayers, constantly hearing it on the minbar, on the Friday khutbah, constantly hearing it with the companions sharing knowledge with each other, etc. What about the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ? How was it preserved? Was it written down?
Yes.
Last week we said that a lot of it was written. Yeah? Some companions had written the sunnah, the words of the Prophet ﷺ down. However, there wasn't that need to compile it the way they compiled the Quran. Why wasn't that need necessary? Because the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is a regularly and daily practiced thing anyway. And this is why now, if I was to ask any of you, what's the proof that when the mu'adhin says Allahu Akbar, you should say Allahu Akbar, Allah? What's the proof? Hadith what?
It's a hadith that you should repeat.
Is it an authentic hadith?
Yes.
Where is this hadith?
I saw it somewhere, but I don't have the reference. But yes, it's an authentic hadith.
So we don't know now. You're hesitant on who reports this hadith. Maybe you thought it's authentic, maybe you didn't. Plus, a sunnah can be what? It can be because of the practice of the companions. Maybe a sunnah could be because of an understanding of the Quran. Maybe a sunnah could be based on a weak hadith, but the Sahaba and the Tabi'in act upon it. So their practice strengthens that. So what's the exact proof? Checking the book. The point is, the evidences are often not memorized by people. But because it's a constantly practiced thing, everyone knows. Everyone knows. If you ask a young child, an older person, what are you supposed to do when the mu'adhin is saying Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar? He knows he should repeat. How does he know? Because this is a regularly practiced thing. What's the proof that Dhuhr is 4 rak'ahs? Authentic?
Yes.
Where is it reported? Sahih, it is authentic. The first hadith is authentic as well. It's hadith in the Sahihain, Bukhari and Muslim. This hadith also in the Sahihain. So the point is, the evidence is, we might not be 100% certain of exactly where this hadith is. Maybe haven't researched the authenticity of the hadith. Maybe we don't know the companions who narrate this hadith. Maybe we don't know the exact wording of the hadith. But we know it's a sunnah because it's a constantly practiced thing. So similarly, most of the sharia is being practiced by the companions day in and day out anyway. And this is, remember, we're talking about the time of the Prophet ﷺ. We're only talking a few years after the Prophet ﷺ's death. So we're not talking about generations afterwards. So that need to write down the sunnah wasn't so strong in their time. But it became a stronger and stronger need as time went on. Of course, the sunnah was written to an extent, but it was mainly memorized and practiced. And the companions radiallahu anhum were fully aware of the strong warning of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam of attributing something to him incorrectly, even by mistake. So the companions were very worried and very cautious to say the Prophet ﷺ said this without being 100% sure. And that shows that even though the sunnah, or some of the sunnah, is memorized and practiced and not written down on paper, the fact that companions are narrating these ahadith shows that there is certainty. Especially knowing that you'll rarely find important practices of Islam only reported by one companion. You'll rarely find them. You'll find important practices of the Sharia reported by this companion, and that one, and that one, and that one, and that one, and then it's reported generation after generation. That's how the deen works. That's how the religion is. It's narrated, transmitted, generation to generation. As the Prophet ﷺ says in the hadith in the Sunan of Abi Dawood, قال يسمعون تسمعون ويسمع منكم ويسمع ممن سمع منكم. تسمعون, you shall hear. He's addressing the companions. ويسمع منكم, and those who come after you will hear from you. and those who come after them will hear from them. وَيُسْمَعُ مِمَّنْ سَمِعَ مِنْكُمْ. And the Prophet ﷺ also says, and the hadith in Sahihain, in the famous incident of Hajjat al-Wada', for example, and elsewhere, قَالَ لِيُبَلِّغِ الشَّاهِدُ مِنْكُمُ الْغَائِبِ. Let those of you who are present inform those of you who are absent. Let those of you who are present inform those of you who are absent. So this idea of spreading knowledge was there during the life of the Prophet ﷺ. It wasn't like everyone was hiding knowledge to himself. Also, the Prophet ﷺ commanding the companions to deliver knowledge shows what? Shows that he trusted them. Shows that he trusted them to deliver his knowledge. قَالَ بَلِّغُوا عَنِّي وَلَوْ آيَةً. Pass on from me, narrate from me, even if it just be one verse. And the hadith we just mentioned now, let those who are present inform those who are absent. And the hadith of Abu Dawood just before it. So, the Prophet ﷺ telling the companions to narrate knowledge shows that he trusted them. And before that, Allah Ta'ala speaking highly of the companions in the Quran shows that they are of a high status. As you know, for a narrator in hadith for his hadith to be accepted, we need two conditions for that person. For a narrator, someone who's passing on a hadith, a statement of the Prophet ﷺ. For us to trust his narration, we want two conditions to be fulfilled. What are those two conditions?
Iman and honesty.
يعني, one of them. قربت. You've got one of them. Honesty, which is adala, trustworthiness. They have to be trustworthy in their religion. Second condition?
Needs to be sound.
Sound what?
Not mental.
Aql, okay, but there's a bit more than that. Someone might not. ضابط. We have aqil, which means that they are sound, mentally stable, sane. But that's not enough. Because you might be sane, but your memory is disastrous. You might be sane, but you make too many errors. How do we know whether someone makes too many errors? Through experience. Through looking through, just as you know this person, I'm not sure if I can trust his narration or his report of what happened yesterday or what happened last week, because you know that he's known to adding a lot or subtracting from things, or he's known to maybe making errors. And that's just you maybe knowing someone not too well. So, dhabt, which is that they are sound in receiving knowledge and delivering knowledge. Now, what if someone says the companions were trustworthy in their religion, but do we know whether they had dhabt? We say trustworthiness in the religion forces you to have dhabt. Generally, especially in the time of the companions. Why in the time of the companions especially, even though this is going a little bit into usul al-hadith, which we want to skip because it's not part of our topic here. The fact that the companions had taqwa and iman meant that they wouldn't be lax in reporting from the Prophet ﷺ. And they had met the Prophet ﷺ, so the likelihood of error is very limited, especially if other companions are confirming their reports. Whereas those who came later on, if someone later on comes and says the Prophet ﷺ said, we say, you didn't see the Prophet ﷺ, you didn't hear them. Between you and him are, a number of people. And your religion and your piety is not the same as that of the companions. So now we have a problem here. We're doubting on whether to accept your statement or not. And if there is doubt, we reject it immediately. If we doubt whether a hadith is authentic, we don't accept it. And this is why the default rule in accepting hadith is that hadith is rejected. You have to prove it's accepted. Is that clear? Someone has to prove that a hadith is authentic for us to accept it. You don't say, okay, we'll accept it unless we can prove otherwise. No. The default rule is that actually we won't accept a hadith. We won't accept a hadith. If we prove that they are authentic through some of the well-known ways of authenticating hadith, that's when we say this is an acceptable hadith. And the science of hadith is an ocean. And there's a lot of work that goes in behind it. and lives that have been put in to preserving the words of the Prophet ﷺ, distinguishing those which are authentic and distinguishing those which are false. So, who are some of the early scholars of hadith who preserved the sunnah from the Sahaba? Who are people who narrated a lot from the Prophet ﷺ? Abu Hurairah, well known, Aisha, Abdullah ibn Umar. Umar narrated also, not as much as these lot, but he narrated. Abdullah ibn Abbas narrated a lot. Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As narrated a lot because, and you'll notice that all of these lived quite late on. All of them lived about 50 or 60 years or 70 years after the Hijrah. Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, Anas ibn Malik lived 90 years plus after the Hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ. And he lived a very long life. So those who narrated the most, you'll find, are those who lived longer. And this is why you don't find so much from Abu Bakr, even though Abu Bakr is the most knowledgeable of them, because he died only 2 years after the Prophet ﷺ. And this is why you don't find so much from Mu'adh ibn Jabal even, because Mu'adh ibn Jabal died relatively early, not as early as Abu Bakr and Umar, but he died relatively early. Umar, you'll find a lot from him because he was the Khalifa of the Muslims, he was the leader of the Muslims. So even though he died relatively early, he was always on the minbar delivering the khutbah on Fridays. And he was always teaching people. And so that's why people narrated a lot from him. So the point is, in every generation, you'll find people who are passing on knowledge. From the tabi'een, who narrated a lot? So the tabi'een are those who are students of the Sahaba. Al-Hasan al-Basri, okay, he narrated. Sa'id al-Musayyib narrated. Sa'id al-Musayyib is from the leaders of the tabi'een. Anyone else? Tabi'een are not very well known. Abu Sa'id al-Khudri is Sahabi. And Abu Sa'id is from those who narrated a lot as well, because Abu Sa'id lived quite late. He was a young companion. I remember we mentioned him last week in the story of Abu Musa al-Ash'ari and Umar ibn Khattab. Who else from the tabi'een? Do you know other tabi'een? Followers of the companions? Urwa ibn Zubayr ibn al-Awwam was from the leaders of Medina, from the tabi'een also. We'll have a look at some of the tabi'een in a second, inshallah. There are many. نعم. فقهاء السبعة كلهم وعطاء ibn Abi Rabah وسعيد ibn Jubayr, فقهاء of Medina, and in Kufa there were many, Alqama, Al-Aswad, and so on, which we'll have a look at in a second. The point is that it was narrated generation after generation. After the time of the companions, which is the time of the tabi'een, people narrated also and wrote. People started to continue to write hadith. People continued to write hadith also, but not as much as it came later on. From those who wrote down a hadith are Hammam ibn Munabbih, rahmatullahi alayh, who is one of the students of Abu Hurairah. And he narrated directly from Abu Hurairah from the Prophet ﷺ. There's only one person between him and the Prophet ﷺ, and that's Abu Hurairah. And this was recorded, and we have that amongst us today also. We have this copy amongst us today. It has about 138 ahadith or something. All of it is in Musnad Imam Ahmad, like I told you last week. From those after that who wrote down as well, from those who come after the tabi'een, so atba' al-tabi'een, the most famous are who? Abu Hanifa narrated, not as much in hadith though, but he narrated, and he was from the leaders in fiqh, which we'll have a look at in a second. Malik ibn Anas narrated, and Malik ibn Anas wrote his Muwatta, his book of hadith. The Muwatta of Malik contains many ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and this book is special in many ways. Firstly, it's special because the time between Imam Malik, or the number of people between Malik and the companions, is one person. The number of people between Imam Malik and between the companions is just one person. And Malik lived where? In Medina. And unlike the other scholars, Malik didn't travel to study. Malik stayed in Medina because the Sunnah was in Medina. The companions were in Medina. Fiqh was in Medina. The continuous practice of the Prophet ﷺ was in Medina. And that's why when somebody came to Rabi' ibn Abi Abdurrahman and he said to him, "This is how we make adhan. Our scholars say you make adhan like this." He says, don't tell me about your scholars. This is the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ. We have adhan in it 5 times a day. From the time of the Prophet ﷺ. From the time of the Prophet, meaning what? 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago only. So it's a continuous practice. That's why the fiqh of Medina has its status. And that's why the hadith of Medina has its status. And that's why Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala is referred to by Abu Hatim or Ibn Abi Hatim, and referred to by Ibn Hibban also as Imam al-Mutqinin. The Imam of the Mutqinin, those who have itqan, those who have perfection and accuracy. He was very accurate and specific in his hadith, in his knowledge of hadith. So we can see very early on, books have been written recording the words of the Prophet ﷺ, recording the words of the Sahaba, who were very close to the time of Malik, and recording the words of the Tabi'een also, who were the teachers of Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala. So Malik is from the earliest to have recorded hadith, from those books at least that we have today with us. Also, from those who wrote, or from those who compiled, Shafi'i wrote, okay. Ahmad ibn Hanbal after him wrote, and we have the Musnad of Ahmad, alhamdulillah, which contains around 30,000 ahadith, or just under that, all of them to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in the time of these scholars, you'll find that every generation has certain things that stand out. So in the later generations, you'll find people were very occupied with philosophy and ilm al-kalam. Yeah? They were very occupied with philosophy and kalam. In the time of these scholars, 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, after the Hijrah, people were very occupied with hadith. Every gathering was a gathering of hadith. And nobody accepted a single word unless you had a direct chain of narration to prove what you said. So people won't accept someone like me sitting here and just saying the Prophet ﷺ said this, Abu Bakr says this, Umar says this, Umar. Hold on. Who told you this? This person told me this. Okay. Who told him? This person told him. Who told him? This person told him. Who told him? He heard directly from Abu Bakr. Thank you. Yeah, our problem is solved. So at that time, narrating knowledge had to be with isnad. Isnad means chain of narration. It had to be with isnad. At that time, knowledge had to be with isnad. Then the scholars, in that period of time, started to write. Like we said, Malik. And the students of Malik wrote, like we said, Shafi'i. Sufyan ibn Uyayna wrote, even though Sufyan ibn Uyayna was almost a contemporary of Malik. Also the scholars after them, Ahmad, Ibn Abi Shayba, Abdul Razzaq al-San'ani. Also after him, Uthman bin Sa'id al-Darimi, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Al-Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Nasa'i, Ibn Majah, and so on. Okay, the books of hadith that we all know today. Okay, the books of hadith that we all know today. Of course, as we said, the Sunnah of the Prophet is preserved by Allah through the actions of people. Through the actions of people. So, what we have today in hadith, if we verify that it's authentic, we verify that this is a statement of the Prophet ﷺ. Because we have a galaxy of human beings who are working to verify the statement of the Prophet ﷺ. Things can't pass. Things won't be allowed to just pass by someone attributing to the Messenger ﷺ without certainty. And unfortunately, a lot of people attributed to the Prophet ﷺ things that were false. Things that were false. And that was happening from early times. One of the biggest reasons for people lying about the Prophet ﷺ is, number one, they had good intentions, but their actions were wrong. Some people said, for example, I saw that people were becoming too occupied with the seerah, the maghazi of Ibn Ishaq. I saw that people were becoming too occupied with the seerah, the history, the biography of the Prophet ﷺ, and being occupied with the fiqh of Abu Hanifa. So I wrote down some ahadith, meaning he made them up. He made up some ahadith about the virtues of the Quran. Every surah. The one who recites Surah Al-Baqarah has this much reward. The one who recites Al-Imran has this much reward. The one who recites this has this much reward. So he thinks he's doing a good thing. He's not doing a good thing. Because you can't attribute to the Prophet ﷺ something he didn't say. You can't do that. Because now you are adding to the religion based on what you believe. You're not the messenger of God. Allah has sent messengers already, and He's told us that He's perfected the religion for us. الْيَوْمَ أَكْمَلْتُ لَكُمْ دِينَكُمْ. Today I have perfected for you your religion. I have completed for you your religion. As Allah says in Surah Al-Ma'idah. So we don't need you to come up with anything, even if it seems to be good, even if it seems to be righteous. In fact, introducing something into the religion, even if it seems to be good, is rejected. Completely rejected. Even if there's a good intention behind it. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ says in the hadith of Aisha, مَنْ أَحْدَثَ فِي أَمْرِنَا هَذَا مَا لَيْسَ مِنْهُ فَهُوَ رَدٌّ. Whoever introduces into our religion, into this affair of ours, something that isn't from it, فَهُوَ رَدٌّ. It's rejected from them. And so, people fabricated a hadith with good intentions. Some people fabricated a hadith because of sectarianism. Sectarianism isn't new. It began at the time of the companions with those tabi'een. Not from the companions themselves. From those who came after the companions. But whilst the companions are still alive, sectarianism began. And so people were so drowned in their sectarianism that they were willing to lie about the Prophet ﷺ to support their views. Sectarianism ليس تشدد تحزب وتعصب للمذهب والرأي وهكذا. Yeah. So sectarianism is the extremism in your group, extremism regarding your sect and the beliefs of your group and your sect and your scholars or your people and so on. And you'll find the scholars of hadith are never like this. Never. The trustworthy Imams of hadith would never attribute to the Prophet ﷺ something that's not true, even if it supports their opinion. And that's why you'll find many hadith which support the positions of Ahlul Sunnah and Ahlul Hadith, but the scholars of hadith consider them false ahadith, fabricated ahadith. For example, the hadith reported by Ibn Majah rahimahullah, in which the Prophet ﷺ is claimed to have said, لا يقبل الله صلاة مبتدع حتى يرجع. Allah does not accept the prayer of an innovator until he returns. Till he returns. That's a false hadith. It's a false hadith. Even though it's in the books of hadith, it's in Sunan Ibn Majah.
Why is he reporting this? Why are these hadiths?
He's reporting the meaning. He's reporting the meaning and he's written it with the isnad. So the way that, and this is a very important thing to keep in mind, why are there fabricated hadith in Islamic books? Why are there false hadith in Islamic books? The way the early scholars of hadith were, is that when they wrote down the chain of narration, they're sort of saying to you, this hadith is reported, but pay attention to the chain of narration. I've written the chain of narration in there for you, so that you can distinguish between what's authentic and false. And this is why a lot of people who attack Islam and attack the companions and attack the Prophet ﷺ and attack a lot of things, they do so using reports that are in our books. They're in our books. They don't have their own books. You don't find the Romans with chains of narration from the time of the Prophet ﷺ to their time, and no one put any effort into that. Everything, whether it's for us or against us, is in our books. But the way of the scholars, rahimahumullah, and this is something that is controversial, because a lot of people disagree with that approach. The way that many scholars did is that they would write the chains of narration and say to you, pay attention, so and so is in the chain, and he's a well-known liar. But I'm just reporting this so that you know this is reported. That people have reported this. I'm just reporting this so that you know, I know that people have reported this. I know this exists. So if someone else comes and tells you, there's a hadith, here you've got it in my book, it's fabricated. You've got it in my book with its chain, so you know it's a fabricated report. So, weak hadith is another discussion, because there's a difference between fabricated hadith and weak hadith. Fabricated hadith are sometimes found in the books of hadith, although they're not many. They're usually found in the later books. Whereas the scholars who had the objective of writing the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, their hadith are generally sound, generally speaking. And if there's a weakness, there's a slight weakness. And that's why you won't find a fabricated hadith in the Muwatta of Malik. Never. In fact, there isn't a weak hadith in the Muwatta of Malik. Every hadith in the Muwatta is sahih, or hasan, or like that. You won't find a fabricated hadith in Sahih Bukhari. You won't find a fabricated hadith in Sahih Muslim. So, the books of hadith had certain objectives. Their objective was to teach the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. They stuck to what's authentic and what is acceptable, generally speaking. And if there is a problem, they would point that out. They would generally point that out. Like Abu Dawood, rahimahullah, At-Tirmidhi, and others. And An-Nasa'i, if there's a problem in the hadith, they would point it out. At-Tirmidhi comments on every hadith, almost. Abu Dawood says, if I'm silent about hadith, then it's an acceptable hadith. وَمَا سَكَتْتُ عَنْهُ فَهُوَ صَالِحٌ. And if there's a problem in a hadith, he comments. So that's those scholars of hadith. But some books contain fabrications. And usually that comes back to historical reports. You will normally find fabrications in historical reports. Things that happened between the companions, things that happened at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, stories, incidents, etc. A lot of it is fabricated. And a lot of it is added and exaggerated and so on. But because there's a chain of narration, the scholars have said, here's the chain of narration, you do your work, you do your research. That was in their time, when people had knowledge of Isnad. People had people to go back to. You've got Ahmed down the corner, you've got Abu Hatim down the corner, you've got Abu Zur'a around the corner. You can just ask them, what do you think of this chain of narration? Today, we don't have that today. Today, those who study Asanid, the chains of narrations, are few. And that's why our reliance today is upon the works of the scholars of hadith who have written their books and recorded them. And this is why you can see now the importance of the books of hadith being written, recorded. So now we are passing down books, generation to generation, and scholars of hadith, whilst they used to previously just teach hadith, now they're teaching books which contain hadith, which contain chains of narration still. Okay? So, it's important to keep in mind that not everything that is attributed to the Prophet is authentic. Not everything is authentic. And if somebody says to you, look, how can you Muslims accept this hadith? Don't be quick to accept. Don't be quick to accept. I've heard from people who are supposedly Islamic scholars, who are critical of books of hadith, and they're using fabrications. Say, look, this book contains this hadith, or this book contains that hadith, or the Prophet ﷺ did this, or Abu Bakr or Umar did this. And you go back and you'll find fabrication, false, inauthentic. He's changed the wording, he's changed the meaning. Always check. Or go to someone who you trust can check. We can't be quick to just accept reports attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man kadhaba alayya muta'ammidan falyatabawwa maq'adahu min an-nar." Anyone who lies about me intentionally, then let him assume his seat in the fire. Because if you're lying about the Prophet ﷺ, even negligently, even if you don't mean to lie, but you're negligent about it, you are contributing towards harming the religion for a lot of people. You won't harm the religion. Islam is not going to be harmed. But you're harming the religion of many people because you'll confuse people. You're creating an imbalance. The Prophet ﷺ came with this and you're now adding this. So that creates an imbalance. We have that which is authentic and you come with that which is fabricated and false. And you add it to the authentic and then throw it in the mixer. No. Same with rulings. Many Islamic rulings are based on ahadith which are fabricated. Fabricated ahadith. Such as لا يدخل الجنة ولد الزنا. The son of zina will not enter Jannah. Meaning, the illegitimate child, a child who comes out of a relationship which is based on adultery or fornication, won't enter Jannah. Just reading that, you know it's not it's not a hadith. Because how can someone be held to account for something they've never done? He's a child, but it's the result of maybe illicit relationships. So the burden is on his parents, not on him. Why would he not enter Jannah? Why would he be punished for something that somebody else did? And so, some people base rulings on these things. They base rulings on things that are false. And this is why it's important for us to be extra cautious when it comes to hadith. Extra cautious when it comes to hadith. Knowing it's authentic is only the first step. We still got another step. What's the second step? So if I hear of a ruling, if I hear of a hadith, the first step is to make sure it's authentic. And that's done through different ways. But there's another step. We're not finished yet. What's that second step? Khalas, we've gone through that. We've said it's an authentic hadith. This hadith was stated by the Prophet ﷺ. Is that we finished?
Is it that matan?
Which means what?
Meaning.
The meaning. Now we have to make sure that we understand it properly. How many times do people use authentic ahadith but to come to incorrect conclusions? I agree with you on the hadith. We agree it's authentic, but I don't agree that this is what it means. I don't agree with you on that. And this is really important in the deen. And that even applies to verses of the Quran. Verses of the Quran, no one disagrees. No one's going to disagree whether a verse is authentic or not. But we might disagree on its meaning. So make sure you confirm. We have to make sure that we confirm the proper meaning of verses of the Quran. Okay. Now, at the time of the companions, radiallahu anhum, were all the companions equal in their knowledge? No. Were some of the companions scholars and others not? Yes. That's the nature of it, wherever you go. Some people are more knowledgeable than others. So what do you expect happened after the death of the Prophet ﷺ? And even whilst the Prophet ﷺ was alive, what do you expect happened? Some are scholars and some are not. Maybe that, there might be some differences in some things which we'll come on to. But what do you think happened when people wanted to learn knowledge? They approached the knowledgeable ones. They would go to certain companions who were known for their knowledge. They wouldn't just ask another companion who just saw the Prophet once in his life, or maybe... Okay. They would go to certain people. So the idea of scholars existing and us trusting those scholars to have knowledge of the Sunnah and therefore approaching them, that was at the time of the companions. Who were from the companions who were well known for their knowledge and giving fatwa, giving rulings? Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, okay. Abdullah ibn Abbas, Mu'adh ibn Jabal, Abdullah ibn Umar, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Zayd ibn Thabit was from the leading muftis and scholars of the Sahaba. Aisha, she was one of the leading scholars of the companions, and they would approach her for all sorts of things because she had more access to the Prophet ﷺ than anyone else. So her knowledge of the Prophet ﷺ's life and doings, a lot of things were just with her and the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, which many other companions might not have had access to. Now, Ali ibn al-Madini rahimahullah, and Ali ibn al-Madini is from the early scholars of hadith. Who's heard of this name before? Ali ibn al-Madini is on par with Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Yahya ibn Ma'in and Imam al-Bukhari and other people like that. In fact, Ali ibn al-Madini is the teacher of al-Bukhari. So Ali ibn al-Madini rahimahullah has authored many books. Unfortunately, many of his books aren't with us. One of them is the Ilal, Ilal of Hadith. In it he talks about those companions who were known for knowledge. He calls them madahib. And so we're going to look at the concept of madahib later on. Ali ibn al-Madini was the teacher of al-Bukhari. So when was he around? 2nd century. 2nd century. Very early. Al-Imam al-Bukhari rahimahullah says, I have never belittled myself in front of anyone. Al-Bukhari was a scholar of hadith. He had impeccable knowledge. He said, I have never belittled myself in front of anyone, except Ali ibn al-Madini. If I'm next to Ali ibn al-Madini, I know my place and I know his place. So Ali ibn al-Madini, we're talking about a giant in hadith. He says, rahimahullah, those companions, or knowledge ended. When he says ended, he doesn't mean ended, as in there was no knowledge afterwards, but he means that knowledge ended up in several scholars from the companions. And those scholars had students. And those students then had students, and those students had students, and that's how knowledge developed. He mentions 3 companions who had knowledge, who were considered companions who had schools. Obviously we know that many other companions also had knowledge. They were scholars also, but there were certain companions who actually had schools, meaning they had students who took their knowledge and passed on their knowledge. When we say knowledge, we're talking about 2 things. We're talking about the Quran, the actual recitation of the Quran. We're talking about the words of the Prophet ﷺ, the actual words of the Prophet ﷺ, and we are talking about their understanding of the Quran and of the Sunnah. That's what knowledge is. Who do you expect these 3 companions were? One was in Medina, one was in Mecca, one was in Iraq. Abdullah Mas'ud was where? Iraq. The Hanafis know that very well. Abdullah Mas'ud radiallahu anhu was in Iraq. He was the Imam of the scholars of Iraq, along with Ali ibn Abi Talib before that. But it was Ibn Mas'ud who continued things on, and he lived longer than Ali as well. طيب, who was the one in Medina? لا, Ibn Abbas was in Mecca, so he's the one in Mecca. Final one is Zayd ibn Thabit. Zayd ibn Thabit. And Ibn Umar is considered from the school, if you want. When I say school, I'm using it loosely. Abdullah ibn Umar is considered to be from the school of Zayd ibn Thabit. And Abdullah ibn Umar and Zayd ibn Thabit are considered to be from the school of Umar ibn Khattab, from Medina. Because it's natural that everyone is influenced by different people. So don't be surprised that one person, has certain opinions because they're influenced by their teacher. You think you're going to spend time with Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and not be impacted by his knowledge? Of course you are. You're going to be so proud of being a student of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, you will force Ibn Mas'ud's opinions down people's throats. That's how humans are. They have certain teachers, they're influenced by those teachers, and then they pass on knowledge of those teachers to everyone else. It's not a surprise. Zayd ibn Thabit also. We're talking about the guy who compiled the Quran for Abu Bakr and Umar, and for Uthman. We're talking about someone who wrote the Quran for the Prophet ﷺ. Are you not going to take knowledge from this individual and then pass it on, act upon it and live by it? Of course. So Ali ibn al-Madini rahimahullah refers to these 3 companions. He says they had وَكَانَ لَهُمْ فَتَاوِ يُفْتُونَ بِهِ وَمَذَاهِبَ يَذْهَبُونَ إِلَيْهِ. Yeah. So the concept of madahib isn't, as people think, late from the Sahaba. The only difference is that the madahib evolved. The madahib evolved. Just like knowledge evolves. Hadith evolved also. Hadith used to be just the Prophet ﷺ speaking and teaching and the companions acting. Very little was written down. Then things evolved. People started to focus more on spreading hadith and teaching hadith. Things evolved further. People started to write hadith. Things evolved further. People started to narrate books of hadith. And so knowledge evolves. That's how knowledge is. And so the existence of madhahib in fiqh is not a new concept. It existed at the time of the companions. The form that we see it in today, the madhab of Abu Hanifa, the madhab of Malik, the madhab of Shafi'i, the madhab of Ahmad, and so on, that's an evolved version of what started with the time, in the time of the companions.
Sorry, would they differ in their opinion in their fatwas?
They won't differ. We'll have a look at that in a second. There is difference, no doubt. There is difference, no doubt. But the difference is not as people imagine it to be. For example, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Let's start with Ibn Mas'ud because he was the oldest. From these three, he was the oldest. He was older than Zayd and he was older than Ibn Abbas. So Ibn Mas'ud was where? In Iraq, in Kufa. He had students. Many students. Who were some of these students? Hamad came later. Alqamah ibn Qais was a student. Who else was a student of Ibn Mas'ud? Masruq was a student of Ibn Abbas. Harith ibn Qais. Ata was a student of Ibn Abbas. Abid al-Salmani was a student of Ibn Mas'ud. طيب, these were students of Ibn Mas'ud. Who's heard of Ibrahim al-Nakha'i? No. Ibrahim al-Nakha'i is not a student of Ibn Mas'ud. In fact, he didn't witness Ibn Mas'ud at all. And he didn't narrate. And this is interesting because Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, even though he's considered from the leading tabi'een, he did not narrate a single hadith from the Sahaba. He didn't narrate a single hadith from the Sahaba. This is just an extra fa'idah on the side. So Ibrahim al-Nakha'i took knowledge from where? The students of Ibn Mas'ud. And he had a number of teachers who were all students of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. And this is in Kufa. Then after Ibrahim al-Nakha'i comes Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman, who is the student of Ibrahim. And then the students of Hamad, the most prominent student of Hamad is Abu Hanifa. Abu Hanifa was born how many years after the Hijrah? 80 years after the Hijrah. So he's still quite early. He's not a tabi'i, by the way. Some people claim that he's a tabi'i and that he was a student of the Sahaba, which is not true. Obviously only Hanafis claim that. No, that's just a light-hearted. Don't be offended, Hanafis in here. He's not a tabi'i. Abu Hanifa rahimahullah wasn't. They claim that he saw Anas with Malik, and they claim that and some people say he saw Anas. We say firstly that doesn't mean anything in terms of knowledge, because seeing someone doesn't mean much unless you narrate knowledge from that person. So that's the first thing. And secondly, even him seeing Anas requires to be proven. Even him seeing Anas radiallahu anhu is questionable in terms of authenticity. So Abu Hanifa rahimahullah was a tabi'i. Abu Hanifa rahimahullah was a follower of the tabi'in. Now, Hanafis are influencing us.
You've been Hanafi for a second.
I don't have a problem being Hanafi. Hanafi's method has been forced upon us here in Birmingham. So Abu Hanifa rahimahullah studied with Hamad for many years. So do you see that there is a school here? There is a system. There are scholars taking from scholars, scholars taking from scholars, scholars taking from scholars. Things don't come out of nowhere. We're talking about people who have taqwa and iman. They're not the type of people who will just blag things, make things up out of the blue. Okay? And this is why you'll find a lot of the opinions that people today criticize from the Hanafi madhab. Ibn Mas'ud. They come from Ibn Mas'ud, one of the senior companions. And other things, they don't come from Ibn Mas'ud, they come from the students of Ibn Mas'ud. And other things that don't come from the students of Ibn Mas'ud come from Ibrahim, from the tabi'een. So that's why when we are critical of something, we have to know exactly its origins, exactly where it comes from. I can't listen to the criticisms of the Hanafi madhab from the Ahl Hadith of India and Pakistan. That's injustice. That's injustice. Just as it would be injustice to listen to the Hanafis when it comes to criticism of Ahl Hadith in India and Pakistan, because we're well aware of the friendly relationship that exists there between them. And so that's why there needs to be justice when dealing with different opinions. And there needs to be knowledge. Don't be quick. We can't be quick to rejecting things without being 100% certain. There are opinions today which some of us would consider disbelief in Allah. People like Ahmad and al-Bukhari and others said these are okay, accepted opinions. Accepted because there were acceptable, knowledgeable scholars who held these views. And so when we hear of something that is different to what we're used to, take things easy. That's a blessing from Allah. That there is scope. There is scope. In the time of the Sahaba, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ requested that the Quran be recited with flexibility. It was revealed upon 7 ahruf. أنزل القرآن على 7 أحرف فاقرؤوا ما تيسر منه, as the Prophet ﷺ says in the hadith in Sahih. So, if that flexibility was needed at the time of the companions, then we are in even more need of a bit of scope and flexibility. And this is actually a blessing for Islam. Some people find it a contradiction. How can you have one God, one Prophet, and there are different opinions amongst Muslim scholars? We say, great, no problem at all. You won't find different opinions though in the core principles. You won't find someone saying Jesus is God, or Jesus is the Son of God, or Jesus is a prophet but he's not God. That type of difference of opinion doesn't exist in Islam. And if somebody was to come up with that type of difference, it would be rejected immediately. So differences on core things, we have the thing today, don't we? So differences in core things are immediately rejected. Whereas differences in things where there is a bit of scope, there's no problem at all. And that's a natural thing, because human minds differ. Human minds differ. And previously we mentioned the incident of the companions radiallahu anhum, when the Prophet ﷺ said to them, لا يصلين أحدكم العصر إلا في بني قريظة. None of you should pray Asr until they get to Bani Qurayza. Some of the companions prayed on the path, on the way there. And some companions prayed when they got there. Even after the time of Asr. Some companions said, no, we can't pray after the time of Asr. And other companions said, no, we'll pray after the time of Asr because the Prophet ﷺ told us to pray when we get there. So in his presence they disagreed on how to understand the words of the Prophet ﷺ. But they didn't disagree on the obligation of Asr. And they didn't disagree that Asr is 4 rak'ahs, or 2 rak'ahs if you're traveling. And they didn't disagree that you read al-Fatiha, make ruku' and make sujood and so on. So you'll see that disagreements are on things which are acceptable. There's a bit of scope. It's not so much of a problem. In fact, Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz rahimahullah, who's from the Tabi'een, considered from the leading scholars also, he says, ما يعجبني أن صحابة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لم يختلفوا. I would not have liked for the companions to have agreed on every single thing. I don't want that. Because if they agreed on every single thing, that means there is a bit of rigidity. Now there's no scope for going outside. You have to follow exactly what they said. Whereas if there's a bit of scope, alhamdulillah, it gives people scope. It gives people scope. Not everything suits everyone. But when it comes to the core principles of Islam, here there's no, it suits us, it doesn't suit us, because these are what make up the faith. So anyways, we'll end with a brief look at the students of Zayd ibn Thabit. The students of Zayd ibn Thabit were from Medina. And they were Sa'id ibn Musayyib, Urwa ibn Zubayr, Kharij ibn Zayd, who was his son, Kharij ibn Zayd ibn Thabit, Qasim ibn Muhammad ibn Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, who was the grandson of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Sulaiman ibn Yasar, as some of the scholars rahimahullah said. And these are referred to as al-Fuqaha al-Sab'a, the 7 jurists of Medina, the 7 Fuqaha of Medina from the Tabi'een, students of the companions. As they say, ألا كل من لم يقتدي بأئمة ألا كل من لم يقتدي بأئمة فقسمته ضيزى عن العلم خارجا فقل هم عبيد الله عروة قاسم سعيد أبو بكر سليمان خارجا. 7 people. ألا كل من لم يقتدي بأئمة, all those who do not follow in the footsteps of the imams, the scholars of knowledge. فقسمته ضيزة عن العلم خارجة, then his portion in knowledge is deficient, outside of knowledge. فقل هم, then he went on to talk about who are these 7 leaders of the tabi'een. فقل هم عبيد الله عروة قاسم. عبيد الله is عبيد الله ibn Abdullah ibn Utbah ibn Mas'ud. Urwa is Urwa ibn Zubayr, the nephew of Aisha. فقل هم عبيد الله عروة قاسم. Qasim ibn Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr, who we said is the grandson of Abu Bakr. عروة قاسم. Sa'id ibn Musayyib, who is the son-in-law of Abu Hurairah. He married the daughter of Abu Hurairah, Sa'id ibn Musayyib. Sa'id Abu Bakr, who is Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr is فقل هم عبيد الله عروة قاسم سعيد أبو بكر. That's Zayd. That's Kharija ibn Zayd. Abu Bakr or Abu Salama. Some of them say Abu Salama, who is Abu Salama ibn Abd al-Rahman. So he's the 4th or 5th? 5th. Sulaiman ibn Yasar. Kharija is Kharija ibn Zayd ibn Thabit. So these are some of the leading scholars of Zayd. And the students of Ibn Abbas include Ata ibn Abi Rabah, Ikrimah, Tawus, Mujahid, Sa'id ibn Jubayr, with Sa'id ibn Jubayr being the most knowledgeable of them, as mentioned by Ali ibn al-Madini. So anyhow, we've gone close to an hour. The point is, knowledge at the time of the companions existed. Schools developed from the companions onto the tabi'een. Those tabi'een had students that passed on the knowledge. And then we will have a look next lesson, inshaAllah ta'ala, at how this then led to the existence of the 4 madhahib of fiqh, and how those developed as well, and what that means today. And we'll also have a look at Ahlul Hadith and Ahlul Ra'i, and the discussion that relates to that. طيب, before we take a seat, does anyone have any comments on what we've covered so far? No. Mas'ud.
They were in 3 places.
Yeah.
Apart from Zayd and the other 2, were they in Medina when the Prophet ﷺ died, or they have traveled before?
La.
How many knowledge they have taken away?
No. All of them were in Medina. To begin with, at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Yeah, all of them were in Medina. After the death of the Prophet ﷺ, with Abu Bakr and Umar coming into leadership, Islam spread in astonishingly quick ways. Islam spread very widely because the Muslims now had a stable sort of station, which was in Medina, and also Mecca eventually. And then Islam spread to different places, to Sham, to Iraq, to Basra, Al-Kufa, and so on. And so some of the companions went to different places. Some of them were sent by Umar or Uthman or others. They were sent to these places. They were sent as scholars to teach the people. They were sent as judges. Okay, they were sent as muftis, people to answer people's questions and things like that. And others went for maybe other reasons, just like any person would go to another place. And so their presence there led to them having students, of course, because people know these are companions. And so therefore, that's how knowledge spread there. Ibn Mas'ud went to Kufa, and he went quite early on, Ibn Mas'ud, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And Ibn Abbas went to Mecca, whilst Zayd ibn Thabit stayed in Medina, rahimahullah ta'ala. So they were there at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and then each person went. But still Medina remained the center. Most companions were still in Medina. But some of the leading scholars went to different places, like Ibn Mas'ud and like Ali ibn Abi Talib, and Mu'adh ibn Jabal went to Sham, and Ibn Abbas went to Mecca, and so on.
Imam Ahmad, he had 30,000 hadith in Muslim, yeah?
Around that, yeah.
What is the average narration between him and the Prophet? The average narrators.
The number of narrators. The average number of narrators between the Prophet ﷺ, between Ahmad and the Prophet ﷺ are 3 people.
That's the shortest.
The shortest is 2 people. يعني لا, sorry, adding to that, the average is 4 people and the shortest is 3 people. So Ahmad ibn Hanbal has many thulathiyat. And Ahmad ibn Hanbal has many ahadith in which between him and the Prophet ﷺ are 3 people. Between him and the Prophet ﷺ are only 3 people. So a narrator, his shaykh, a tabi'i, a companion, and then the Prophet ﷺ. Most of it is 4 narrators, 5 narrators, and so on. But even 3 narrators is a lot. It's a lot in the Musnad. It's not 1 or 2 ahadith. It's over 300 ahadith. So over 300 ahadith, the chains of narration are very short. Some of them say even more than that. So Ahmad was quite early on. Barakallahu feekum. Naam, tayyib, tfaddal. Sisters, if you have something so that we don't neglect you like we normally neglect you. تفضل.
تحدث عن اختلاف المذاهب, differences in different method.
نعم.
Can you take with the opinion, for example, with one sheikh in one question and another sheikh with another question?
Can you take with the opinion of one scholar on one issue?
When you talk about
and can you take with the position of one scholar on one issue and another scholar on another issue?
Yeah.
A scholar from a different madhab, or even a scholar with a different opinion, even from the same madhab, because sometimes from the same madhab they have different opinions. The answer is, if there is a valid reason, yes. And if there is an invalid reason, no. That's the general rule. A valid reason such as what? A valid reason such as you feel this scholar is more knowledgeable. You asked him on one issue, but you find this scholar to be more knowledgeable, so next time you ask him. Or you did a bit of research on your own, and you're more convinced and more comfortable with this scholar's opinion. No problem in changing. So if someone who follows the Hanbali madhab does a bit of research and finds more comfort in the position of a Shafi'i, it's permissible for him to take with that opinion. We don't say wajib. Why we don't say wajib, and we'll discuss this later on inshallah in upcoming classes. We don't say wajib for a number of reasons. But we say it's permissible. So if someone wanted to change his madhab for that reason, it's permissible. If someone wanted to change his normal position because of a severe hardship, we say permissible also. Permissible also. If someone wanted to change, the madhab they normally follow, occasionally, because they find some ease, occasionally, but that can't be a regular thing. If it's a regular thing, it's impermissible. But if it's an occasional thing, due to some sort of hardship or something like that, then there's scope in changing. So the general rule is that you follow the scholar who you feel is most capable of telling you what Allah has commanded. That's it. That's the role of a non-scholar. A non-scholar asks a person of knowledge who they feel will be most capable of giving them the correct answer based on what Allah wants them to do. And that goes back to your effort. You put the effort into finding the most suitable person.
I think this one put a little under confusion, I think, or confusing issue at the moment. Because there's one sheikh from Palestine, I forget his name at the moment. He said, don't take any madhab. We are linked to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Yes.
And we're not following these people actually. They say that I'm Hanafi, I'm whatever, so that's me, I can't take something else from somebody else.
As we said, knowledge is transmission. Knowledge is not revelation. Revelation finished when the Prophet ﷺ died.
So does that mean take from whoever you like?
No, absolutely not.
Whoever you like?
No chance.
Because that's what I'm trying to say. Take whatever you like, whoever you like, whenever you like. Because we are belong to Islam, and we know there's no difference between them. No deviation between this
Between who?
I mean, yes, for little things, it's not for basic things, not for the core, it's for the scopes. So if for the scopes, so as he said, actually, it's no problem. But for the core things, we're not saying that they have to pray 3 dhuhr or 4.
You don't need a scholar for that. No one asked, no one went to a scholar to ask how many rak'ahs is dhuhr. Only those who have just been introduced to Islam.
So just to give an example for that, when I was in Emirates, I think one Pakistani a guy actually started to ask me a question there, because I'm obviously you can't read and you understand more from me about our books and whatever. So I asked Shaykh there about rida'ah. What's the dog in English? I forget them.
Suckling.
Yeah, which is sucking from. So he said, like his wife, he gave milk for that girl while she was young, was small, and now he wants to get married from his son. So is it okay or not okay? So I told him, I know that, so it should be like 3 or 2. What let me ask?
Okay.
So somebody saying 1 full sucking will be enough. The other sheikh saying no, it should be 3. So that's why. So when I come back to him, well, I said I'm confused. So I said, yes, I'm with you as well, because I'm not sheikh, and he's not sheikh like me. So now, which way must I pick?
That's why, like we said, the job of a non-scholar, someone who's not a scholar, his role is. We say that the Prophet is our prophet. We don't have the Prophet with us.
Exactly.
So therefore, there's no room except to pass on transmitted knowledge, transmitted sunnah, what we have from the Prophet sunnah. And remember, we said if we establish that a sunnah is authentic, we have a second step, which is to make sure we understand it properly. The problem with someone who hasn't spent time with the Quran, hasn't spent time with the Prophet sunnah, how is he going to come to a conclusion? Don't we have laws here in the United Kingdom? Don't we have statutes? Don't we have case law? Can everyone become a judge? Why not? It's there in the books. Go back to text cases and materials. We used to study at university. Text cases and materials, family law. Pick up a textbook, find the relevant case law, find the relevant statute law. I can give a verdict myself. No, you can't. Because it requires study, it requires experience, it requires time. Similarly, when it comes to understanding the text of the Quran and the text of the Prophet ﷺ, to make sure it's understood properly, there are people who have spent 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years of their lives ensuring that they're understanding this stuff properly. Of course it makes sense to go to these people to check, to make sure that your understanding is correct. Especially on things that are confusing, like you just mentioned. Things where there is a bit of difference. Our role is not to ask many different scholars, no. Our role is to ask one person who we trust. If he gives you an answer, you take with that answer. Because if you ask one person who you trust, then the next person, then the next person, that's what will happen is what happened in this case, which is he'll be confused. Because he'll mention a ruling with a dalil, and he'll mention a ruling with a dalil, and he'll mention a ruling with a dalil. There's no escape. So you go to the person who you trust most in their knowledge and their piety, and there are indicators that indicate who a person should go to, and that's how you resolve problems. If someone then comes to you afterwards and said, no, that fatwa is wrong, you say, thank you very much. I've already asked someone who I trust. I didn't come to you asking for a fatwa. I went to them because I trusted them. So I'm going to stick to that opinion. Even if he comes to you with a different opinion, even if he comes to you with dalil, even if he comes to you with 100 dalil. Otherwise, like you said, we're going to be going around in circles. From this person to the next person, the next person, this person to the next person. When you become a scholar yourself, that's when we can do things ourselves. And we can know conclusions ourselves, know answers ourselves. Then it will be much easier in that case. No, Allahu A'lam. Barakallahu feekum. We continue next week, inshallah ta'ala. And welcome, take a seat and join us. Hey, sisters, if you have any comments? Barakallahu feekum. Next time, sisters, if you, so that it's not last minute, if you don't want to just shout out your questions, you can write them down during the lesson if you want, and then pass them over and we can have a look at it next week, inshallah. Allah